Heavenly Father, as this new morning begins, I come before you with a humble and open heart. I thank you for the gift of life, for the breath in my lungs, and for the assurance that your mercies are new every morning. Today, I choose to begin not with worry or fear, but with faith, trusting that the God who woke me up is the God who will carry me through every moment of this day. Lord, I acknowledge that you are the one who began a good work in me. Before I ever understood your plans, you were already shaping my life with purpose. You saw my future when I was still learning how to trust you. You planted seeds of hope, faith, and calling within my heart, and even when I failed to see them, you never stopped working. I praise you because your work is intentional, and your plans are always good. Trusting God's faithfulness in the process requires a heart that learns to rest even when understanding is incomplete. There are seasons when progress feels slow and prayers seem unanswered, yet faith is not built on visible results but on confidence in who God is. From the very beginning, God has proven himself to be consistent, unchanging, and reliable. He does not start what he does not intend to finish, and his faithfulness is not measured by how quickly circumstances change, but by how securely he holds his promises. Often the process feels uncomfortable, because growth stretches areas we did not know needed healing. God works deeply, not hastily. While we may desire immediate transformation, he values lasting change. Every delay, every challenge, and every quiet season serves a purpose that aligns with his wisdom. Trusting him means believing that even when nothing appears to be happening, he is still actively shaping, correcting, and strengthening what he has placed within us. Faithfulness is revealed most clearly when human strength runs out. In moments of weakness, God shows that his power does not depend on our ability to maintain perfection. He remains faithful even when faith feels fragile. When doubt creeps in and questions arise, his promises remain intact. He does not withdraw his hand because of uncertainty. Instead, he invites deeper dependence. Trust grows not by avoiding struggle, but by encountering God within it. The process often involves waiting, and waiting tests patience more than anything else. Waiting exposes fear, impatience, and the need for control. Yet in waiting, God teaches surrender. He reminds us that his timing is never accidental. What feels delayed is often protected. What feels held is often being prepared. Trusting God's faithfulness means choosing peace over panic and belief over pressure, even when answers are not immediate. There are times when the process includes failure, mistakes, and detours that seem unnecessary. God's faithfulness does not erase consequences, but it redeems them. He weaves lessons into setbacks and wisdom into disappointment. Nothing is wasted in his hands. Even broken moments become building materials for maturity. Trust is strengthened when one realizes that God is not limited by past errors or present confusion. God's faithfulness is consistent regardless of emotional seasons. Feelings change, motivation fluctuates, but God remains steady. When joy is abundant, he is faithful. When sorrow weighs heavily, he is still faithful. Trusting him requires anchoring belief not in emotions but in truth. His word does not shift with circumstances, and his character does not change with seasons. Holding on to this truth brings stability when everything else feels uncertain. Trusting the process also means accepting that growth is often invisible before it becomes evident. Just as roots grow underground before a tree bears fruit, God works internally before transformation appears outwardly. Character is shaped quietly through obedience, perseverance, and humility. The process refines intentions, aligns desires, and strengthens conviction. What God forms in private eventually sustains what he reveals in public. God's faithfulness assures that identity is not defined by progress alone, but by belonging. Even when growth feels slow, his love remains constant. Trust deepens when one understands that God's commitment is not based on performance. He does not abandon what he calls his own. Every step forward, Every pause and every struggle exists within the safety of His care. Learning to trust God's faithfulness requires daily surrender. Each morning becomes an opportunity to release control and renew confidence. Trust is not a one-time decision, but a continual choice to believe that God sees the full picture. His plans extend beyond the present moment, beyond current limitations, and beyond human understanding. In the process, trust becomes less about knowing what God will do next and more about knowing who He is now. As trust grows, peace begins to replace anxiety. Fear loses its grip, and hope finds room to breathe. The process becomes less about reaching an end and more about walking with God through each step. Trusting His faithfulness transforms waiting into worship and uncertainty into reliance. Allowing the heart to remain steady even when the journey feels unfinished, surrendering to God's ongoing work, begins with the recognition that personal control often limits spiritual growth. Human nature desires certainty, structure, and immediate clarity, yet God often works in ways that require trust beyond understanding. Surrender is not weakness. It is a conscious decision to place confidence in God's wisdom rather than personal perception. It means releasing the need to manage outcomes and allowing God to lead the process according to His perfect will. True surrender requires honesty before God. It involves acknowledging fears, struggles, and unanswered questions without pretending strength that does not exist. God does not demand perfection before He works. He invites openness. When the heart becomes transparent, God is free to shape, correct, and restore. Surrender allows God access to areas that resistance keeps hidden, and those areas often hold the deepest potential for transformation. God's ongoing work often challenges comfort zones. He may disrupt familiar patterns, remove unhealthy attachments, or redirect plans that once felt secure. These moments can feel unsettling, but they are often necessary for growth. Surrender means trusting that God's intentions are rooted in love, even when the process feels uncomfortable. Letting go of what feels safe makes room for what is purposeful. Surrender also requires patience with the process. Spiritual growth is not instant. It unfolds over time through obedience and endurance. God works layer by layer, addressing what is ready to be healed, strengthened, or refined. Attempting to rush this work often leads to frustration. Surrender invites rest, allowing God to work at His pace rather than forcing change through human effort. There are moments when surrender involves releasing past identities and expectations. God's work reshapes how one sees oneself and the future. Old labels, failures, and limitations lose their authority when placed in God's hands. Surrendering identity allows God to redefine purpose according to His truth rather than past experiences. This transformation brings freedom, replacing self-doubt with confidence rooted in God's calling. Surrendering to God's work means trusting Him in uncertainty. Not every step will be clear, and not every answer will come immediately. Faith grows strongest when it is exercised without visible confirmation. God often reveals direction gradually, requiring obedience one step at a time. Surrender chooses faith over fear, believing that God's guidance will come at the right moment. God's ongoing work also includes discipline, which is often misunderstood. Discipline is not punishment but correction guided by love. Surrender accepts God's correction without resentment, recognizing that He disciplines those He loves. Through correction, character is shaped and wisdom is gained. Resisting discipline delays growth, while surrender accelerates maturity. Letting God work requires releasing comparison. Comparing progress with others creates pressure and discouragement. God's work is personal and unique. Surrender embraces individuality, trusting that God knows exactly what is needed in each season. Growth is not measured by speed but by depth. God values authenticity more than appearance, and surrender allows growth to unfold naturally. Surrender is a daily decision, not a one-time act. Each day presents new opportunities to trust God with thoughts, emotions, plans, and reactions. choosing surrender repeatedly builds spiritual strength. Over time, resistance softens and obedience becomes more natural. The heart learns to rest in God's leadership rather than striving for control. As surrender deepens, peace begins to replace anxiety. Burdens feel lighter because they are no longer carried alone. God's presence becomes more evident, and trust becomes more natural. Surrender aligns the heart with God's purpose, allowing His work to continue without interruption, shaping character, strengthening faith, and guiding life according to His divine design. Spiritual growth through refinement often begins in seasons that feel challenging rather than comfortable. Refinement implies a process where impurities are revealed and removed, and this process can feel intense. God uses refinement not to harm but to purify, shaping the inner life so that faith becomes genuine and resilient. Growth rarely happens when everything feels easy. It develops when trust is tested and dependence on God deepens. Refinement exposes areas of the heart that need transformation. Attitudes, habits, and thought patterns that once went unnoticed come to the surface. This exposure can feel uncomfortable, but it is an act of grace. God reveals what needs change so that healing can occur. Avoiding refinement may preserve comfort temporarily, but it prevents lasting growth. Embracing refinement allows God to form strength where weakness once existed. The process of refinement requires humility. Pride resists correction, but humility welcomes it. Spiritual growth accelerates when the heart remains teachable. God shapes those who are willing to listen, learn, and adjust. Humility opens the door to deeper understanding, allowing wisdom to replace assumption and discernment to replace impulse. Refinement trains the heart to value truth over ego. Refinement also strengthens faith by shifting reliance away from self. When personal ability proves insufficient, dependence on God becomes essential. These moments strip away false confidence and replace it with trust rooted in God's power. Spiritual maturity develops when faith is no longer based on circumstance but on conviction. Refinement clarifies what truly matters, aligning priorities with eternal purpose rather than temporary success. God often uses trials as tools of refinement. Difficult experiences challenge belief systems and test perseverance. Trials reveal whether faith is conditional or committed. Through endurance, character is built and resilience grows. Refinement does not mean the absence of struggle. It means discovering God's presence within struggle. Each challenge becomes an opportunity for growth rather than defeat. Refinement reshapes perspective. What once felt like setbacks begin to appear as preparation. Disappointments gain meaning when seen through the lens of growth. God uses refinement to shift focus from outcomes to obedience. Spiritual growth flourishes when trust remains steady regardless of results. Refinement teaches patience, reminding the heart that lasting transformation takes time. The refining process also involves letting go. God removes attachments that hinder growth, whether they are unhealthy relationships, harmful mindsets, or misplaced priorities. Letting go can feel like loss, but it often leads to freedom. Refinement clears space for what aligns with God's purpose. Holding on to what no longer serves spiritual growth delays progress. Refinement strengthens integrity by aligning actions with belief. Spiritual growth is not measured by words but by consistent character. Through refinement, integrity is tested and strengthened. God shapes behavior to reflect faith in practical ways. Choices become guided by conviction rather than convenience. Refinement ensures that faith remains authentic rather than superficial. Growth through refinement also deepens compassion. Experiencing God's shaping work fosters empathy for others in their own processes. Understanding personal struggle creates space for grace. Refinement softens the heart, replacing judgment with understanding. Spiritual maturity includes the ability to walk alongside others with patience and kindness. As refinement continues, faith becomes more resilient. Challenges no longer threaten belief but strengthen it. The heart learns to remain steady in uncertainty. Refinement produces endurance, allowing faith to withstand pressure without losing clarity. Spiritual growth through refinement is not about perfection, but about progress shaped by God's wisdom. Refinement ultimately aligns the heart with God's purpose. As impurities are removed, clarity increases. Spiritual growth becomes evident not through outward display, but through inner stability. Faith matures, trust deepens, and the connection with God strengthens, allowing life to reflect the transformation taking place within. Living as a testimony of God's grace begins with the understanding that grace is not earned but received. A testimony is not a display of perfection. It is evidence of transformation. God's grace becomes visible when change takes place over time, when weakness is met with strength from God, and when brokenness is restored through His love. A life shaped by grace reflects humility, gratitude, and dependence on God rather than self. Grace works most powerfully in ordinary moments. It shows in patience during difficulty, kindness in conflict, and faith in uncertainty. Living as a testimony means allowing God's grace to influence daily choices and reactions. Words, attitudes, and actions become reflections of God's work within. Grace teaches how to respond with compassion rather than anger, forgiveness rather than resentment, and hope rather than despair. A testimony of grace is often formed through past struggles. Experiences of failure, loss, and disappointment become part of the story God uses to encourage others. Grace does not erase the past, it redeems it. What once caused shame becomes a source of strength when surrendered to God. Living openly about God's grace allows others to see that restoration is possible and that no situation is beyond God's reach. Living as a testimony requires consistency. Faith is demonstrated not only in public moments but in private decisions. Grace shapes character when no one is watching. Integrity becomes a natural response when the heart is aligned with God. Consistent obedience strengthens credibility, allowing the testimony to carry authenticity. Grace transforms intentions into actions that reflect God's love. Grace also produces humility. Recognizing that progress comes from God removes the need for comparison or pride. A life marked by grace acknowledges dependence on God in every season. Humility invites God's continued work and creates space for growth. Living as a testimony means pointing others toward God rather than drawing attention to personal achievement. Forgiveness is a powerful expression of grace. Choosing to forgive reflects God's mercy and releases the burden of bitterness. Living as a testimony includes extending grace to others as it has been received. Forgiveness demonstrates trust in God's justice and healing. It shows that grace has the power to heal relationships and restore peace. Grace-filled living influences how challenges are handled. Difficult situations become opportunities to demonstrate faith and perseverance. Instead of responding with fear or frustration, grace produces calm assurance. Others notice when hope remains strong despite adversity. This response becomes a testimony of God's sustaining power and presence. Living as a testimony of grace also involves serving others. Grace motivates selflessness and generosity. Serving reflects gratitude for what God has done. Acts of love become expressions of worship. Grace inspires the heart to give, encourage, and support without expectation of return. Service reflects the heart of God and amplifies the testimony of grace. As grace continues to shape life, confidence grows not in self but in God. Trust replaces doubt, and peace replaces anxiety. A testimony becomes visible through transformed priorities and renewed purpose. Living by grace allows life to reflect God's faithfulness, showing that His work continues to shape, restore, and strengthen those who surrender to Him, living as a testimony of God's grace begins with the awareness that grace is the foundation of transformation, not human effort. A testimony is formed when life reflects God's work rather than personal perfection. God's grace becomes visible through change, endurance, and renewal. It is seen in how weaknesses are met with divine strength and how failures become part of a redeemed story. Grace shapes identity, reminding the heart that worth is found in God's love, not in achievements. A life marked by grace reflects gratitude in everyday moments. Gratitude shifts focus from what is lacking to what God has already provided. This attitude influences speech, decisions, and relationships. Living as a testimony means carrying a spirit of thankfulness that remains steady even in difficulty. Grace teaches the heart to recognize God's presence in both abundance and scarcity, allowing faith to remain grounded regardless of circumstance. God's grace becomes evident through humility. Humility acknowledges that growth comes from God's guidance and mercy. Living as a testimony requires surrendering pride and self-reliance. Grace-centered humility allows God to receive glory for transformation. When humility shapes character, interactions with others become gentle and respectful. Grace removes the need to prove worth and replaces it with confidence rooted in God's acceptance. Grace influences how struggles are handled. Challenges no longer define identity, but become opportunities to demonstrate trust in God. Living as a testimony means responding to adversity with faith rather than fear. When patience replaces frustration and hope replaces despair, God's grace becomes visible. Others are encouraged by a faith that remains steady under pressure. Grace-filled endurance speaks louder than words. Forgiveness is one of the clearest expressions of grace. Choosing to forgive reflects an understanding of God's mercy. Living as a testimony involves extending grace even when it is undeserved. Forgiveness frees the heart from bitterness and creates space for healing. Grace empowers the ability to release hurt without minimizing pain. This act of obedience reflects God's love and restores peace within. Grace shapes relationships by encouraging compassion and empathy. Understanding personal need for grace increases patience toward others. Living as a testimony means responding with kindness instead of judgment. Grace-filled compassion recognizes that everyone is in a process. This perspective fosters understanding and strengthens connections. God's grace expressed through relationships becomes a powerful witness of His love. Living as a testimony of grace also means allowing God to use past experiences for His purpose. Past mistakes and hardships become part of a greater story of redemption. Grace reframes the past, turning regret into wisdom. Sharing experiences honestly reflects God's restoring power. Transparency allows others to see that transformation is possible through God's grace. Grace influences daily choices by guiding actions with love and integrity. Living as a testimony involves aligning behavior with faith. Grace-filled living prioritizes obedience over convenience. Decisions are made with awareness of God's presence. Integrity becomes consistent, whether observed or unseen. Grace produces authenticity, allowing faith to be lived genuinely rather than performed. Serving others is another expression of grace at work. Grace motivates generosity without expectation. Living as a testimony means offering time, encouragement, and support willingly. Service reflects gratitude for God's grace. Acts of kindness become extensions of worship. Through service, grace flows outward, impacting lives and reflecting God's heart. Grace-filled living produces peace that surpasses understanding. Trust in God's faithfulness reduces anxiety and fear. Living as a testimony means resting in God's promises. Peace becomes evident through calm assurance and steady hope. Others recognize the difference grace makes in how life is approached. As grace continues its work, priorities shift. Temporary concerns lose their grip, and eternal purpose gains focus. Living as a testimony reflects a life shaped by God's ongoing work. Faith deepens, character strengthens, and dependence on God grows. Grace transforms the ordinary into something meaningful, allowing life to continually reflect God's love, mercy, and faithfulness, Lord. I thank you in advance for what you are still doing in me and through me. I trust that every trial has a purpose, every delay has meaning, and every lesson is shaping me for something greater. I rest in the promise that you will complete the good work you started in me, not according to my timeline, but according to your perfect will. This morning, I walk forward with hope, confidence, and surrender. My life is in your hands, and my future is secure in you. Amen.